summer of 2004, when my husband Keith and I were visiting Oslo and my dad, I began this little project. At first, I assumed it would be just that, the little project, but that was not how it turned out. At the time, my father, Jens Brambani, was 88 years old and had been living in a nursing home on the outskirts of Oslo for several years. My mother had died more than a decade earlier. My dad was the oldest remaining person in our family. Keith and I visited him in the nursing home every year during our travels. Although quite old, he was still very alert, but was confined to a wheelchair. He had a very nice room with a balcony and a fantastic view of Oslo. And the nursing home was only about 200 meters from the house where he had lived most of his life, on the same street. My brother and I had tried for years to get Dad to talk about what he experienced during the war. He did not seem interested in doing this. He was always worried he would be labeled a hero, which he insisted he was not. But Keith said now or never, and suggested I begin to interview him, ask him questions about what, where, how from the war years. All his memories from and about that awful time would soon be gone forever, disappear with him into his grave. So we began the process to try and help him dig out some of what he had suppressed, to talk about what he had kept silent all those years. World War II was not history for him. He was there. He was not a bystander. He participated and he suffered greatly. It was all still, till the very end, very much a part of his life. Next. Bill, next.
Yeah, right. Okay.
My dad was born in 1916 at Stange, a farming community near the town of Hamar. Next, Bill. Yeah. His parents at the time owned a farm. I think you could call my grandfather a gentleman farmer. Two of Dad's grandparents were immigrants from northern Italy. My dad had 4 living siblings in 1940. They moved to Oslo in 1920 to the house at Grefsen, where later I also came to live. My mom grew up at Lofthus, another Oslo suburb. Her father, min bestefar, was a painter, an accomplished rosemaling artist, but his livelihood was painting Oslo streetcars and buses. Mom had one brother, Gunnar. Next, Bill. The war and the German occupation of Norway began on April 9, 1940. When I asked my dad if he could describe what he thought and felt on that infamous day, he said he could not. That day and the feelings that Norwegians experienced were impossible to describe, he said. The situation was so surreal. German soldiers marching in step through the streets of Oslo as if it was their city, as if Norway suddenly was their country. Norwegians were paralyzed. They had a difficult time believing this could actually be happening. The next day, April 10, rumors were ripe in Oslo that the British were about to bomb the city. This led everyone to try and get out of town as soon as possible. People panicked. The streetcars, trikker, were overloaded with passengers hanging on to them as best they could on their way out of town and going practically empty back down again. The nearby forests were full of citizens who ended up spending several cold days and nights there before they dared to go back home. Next, Bill. Dad was doing his military service when the war broke out. He was stationed at a small depot only 1 kilometer from home, which meant that he could sleep at home and made 2 kroner extra per day. But on April 10, Dad and his fellow soldiers became desperate to do something concrete to offer resistance to the invaders. They were able to drive to the town of Gjøvik on the west side of Lake Mjøsa and got in touch with Norwegian military officers there who gave them jobs. They were instructed to do guard duty at the harbor, as it was expected that the Germans would come across the ice-covered lake from the town of Hamar. After a few days, when this did not happen, Dad and some of his fellow soldiers received orders to make their tumbos to transport injured English soldiers to Åndalsnes. They succeeded in doing this. But on their way back to Oslo, they were arrested by Germans and taken to a prison camp where they stayed a few days before they managed to escape in a car they picked up along the road. Dad said it was not difficult to get hold of a car. There were abandoned cars everywhere. They made their way down Gudbrandsdalen Valley, still in their Norwegian military uniforms. At the place called Sel, they discovered the bridge across the river had been blown up. In order to get to Oslo, they hauled the car onto the railroad tracks and nervously moved the car along. They were especially nervous when they had to go through a tunnel, but fortunately, no train came. Next, Bill. Not everyone thought that the Norwegians put up enough resistance when the Germans invaded Norway. Leland Stowe was a well-known American journalist whose great scoop was that he happened to be in Oslo on April 9. He watched the Germans march up Karl Johans gate from his balcony at the Grand Hotel. He described in forceful terms how 1,400 German soldiers marched into Oslo while 30 to 40,000 Norwegians were watching without as much as raising a finger or booing. He wrote that even several days later, the Norwegians were still paralyzed. Stowe told about interviewing Norwegians who only asked, "Why don't the British do anything? What are the Americans going to do?" When Stowe answered, "What are you going to do?" he only found one woman who had shame enough to blush. There was treason in Norway, regardless of what Mr. Hambro, Norway's prime minister in London, says, Stowe declared in a lecture at Columbia University in February 1941. Stowe's articles in American newspapers and his many lectures were bad advertising for occupied Norway and for exiled Norway. Minister Morgenstjerne at the Norwegian legation in Washington, D.C., did a lot of work and informed the United States about Norway's situation and attempted to counter Stowe's criticism. Next, Bill. This is my mom and dad. They got engaged on his birthday in 1941. She was only 19. And the next, Bill. This is 3 of my dad's siblings and my grandmother, my farmor. Dad's sister, Anne, was a nursing student at Drammen Hospital when she was notified on July 29, 1942, that her mother and brother, Kalle, had both been arrested by Gestapo. Heinrich Felix himself, the head of SIPO, German security police, plus an aide, came to their home and arrested them. The reason for their arrest was that the family gave shelter to saboteurs who came from England and were dropped in parachutes from small planes into Nordmarka, the vast forests surrounding Oslo. These brave people had to have safe houses, and our family provided this in their home at Grefsen. Everything about these saboteurs was very, very secret, Dad said. No one knew their names nor anything about them. The slogan was, "Keep quiet." Dad saw one of them unexpectedly only once, as he entered unannounced into the man's bedroom. He was asleep, but jumped up with his gun ready to shoot. One of these saboteurs broke down and talked when he was caught and interrogated and tortured by Gestapo. This led to the unraveling of the Horten gang, and everyone involved in their undercover work was arrested in July 1942. Dad thought it was only their home in our neighborhood where saboteurs were able to hide. At least he didn't know of other families who did this. But it could have been possible because everything was so hush-hush. As soon as his sister Anne heard about her family's arrest, she jumped on a bike and biked from Drammen to Valdres, about 200 kilometers, in order to warn their brother Frikken, who immediately understood how dangerous the situation was for him. And Dad was absolutely certain that Anne saved her brother's life by warning him, as he was then able to flee to Sweden, where he remained for the rest of the war. In early 1942, Frikken and two friends had stolen German uniforms and a German car in order to rescue a prisoner from Ullevål Hospital. Dad said he never knew whom they were rescuing, but they were certain that the person would be executed when he was released from the hospital. Frikken and his friends were successful in their assignment. Next, Bill. All of the larger companies in Oslo were ordered to provide male personnel to work for the Germans. This included Kreditkassen Bank, where Dad had worked since 1937. He had returned to his cashier job after his stint in the military in 1940. Together with other male employees, he was told to take a train to Trondheim and from there further north to Sandnessjøen. They were taken in a fishing boat to a small island called Ylvingen in order to build barracks that the Germans planned to use to house East European prisoners. In the middle of this island is a hilltop that the locals today refer to as the German Hill, which contains leftover bunkers and cannons from the war. After only a day or two, Dad was returned to Sandnessjøen, where he was arrested by the Gestapo, who took him to Trondheim, to Vollan prison. Here he was interrogated, he said, with two gorillas sitting behind me. They asked him whether he knew why he was arrested. No, he said. With that answer, someone punched him in the face, so blood squirted from his nose and mouth. They grilled him about his brother Frikken and whether Dad knew who his friends were. Next, Bill. Dad, his mom, min farmor, and his brother Kalle were all taken to Grini prison camp, the first concentration camp in Norway. Grini, which today is called Ila Security Institute, was built just prior to the war as a prison for women. During the war, as many as 5,000 persons were imprisoned there at the time, both men and women. 20,000 Norwegians endured shorter or longer stays there. Thousands of Norwegian families suffered the same fate as ours. To be imprisoned by the Germans became something honorable, because so many good Norwegians were in the same situation. Next, Bill. Dad was confined at Grini until December 1943. His brother Kalle was also arrested and sent to Grini. He was put in a cell with the nickname the Parachute. Those who received a death sentence was sent there. Dad never knew why Kalle spent 1.5 years locked up there. Kalle stayed at Grini till January 44 and then was transported to Sachsenhausen, where he remained until the end of the war. While at Grini, Dad did not have any kind of job. He was simply a prisoner, a political prisoner. He lived in the same cell, number 49 in the main building, together with the same fellow prisoner for more than 15 months. His cellmate was a mailman from Drammen. He had been imprisoned for participation in the Horten case, for which Dad's mom and Kalle were also arrested. Dad said several days could pass without the two of them talking to each other. They never had any contact after the war. Dad thought that was strange when he thought about it afterwards. Did he ever receive any visitors from family or friends while at Grini? My mom, Marit, was allowed to visit him only once. She was the only one. Nobody else were allowed. When she received permission to see him, she was given a conversation permit by the Gestapo. They had to see each other in a meeting room and were not allowed to speak freely. A Hirt girl, a young Norwegian woman who was a member of the Norwegian Hitlerjugend, sat next to them and listened to everything they said. It was strictly forbidden to talk about the prison conditions or about other prisoners. On Christmas Eve, Dad asked if he could be allowed to visit with his mother. He knew she was imprisoned in the same corridor at Grini, but the answer he received was 9. The only other thing he remembered from Christmas Eve in 42 was that the Christmas meal was vassgraut, water porridge. While his mom was a prisoner at Grini, she discovered a lump in one of her breasts. She was sent to Ullevål Hospital, where doctors removed her cancerous breast. For the duration of her hospital stay, a Norwegian policeman guarded her, sat on a chair next to her bed to make sure she would not run away. Dad thinks that the breast cancer actually saved his mother's life. His cell at Grini was a very small room, but with a large window facing the assembly square. But the window was painted over to keep them from looking outside. But they scraped tiny holes in the paint to peek through. They took turns climbing up on the top bunk bed because they could look out from the top window and also open it. They spent an hour at a time up there. And this way they were even able to sun themselves occasionally. Dad remembered getting a suntanned face. The only furniture were the bunk beds, a sink with nothing but cold water, and a zinc bucket they had to use for a toilet. After they had used the bucket, they placed it into a trapdoor where it was collected and emptied. The food was delivered through a small hatch in the door. The only kind of silverware was 1 soup spoon for each. The prisoners were given very little food at Grini, a piece of bread and now and then a little dark syrup or molasses, which was probably intended as animal fodder. The dinner, which was made in the camp kitchen by other prisoners, usually consisted of something they called flour soup, a vegetable soup which was mainly boiled cabbage leaves with meat bouillon, but without any fat, or they were given storm soup, which was potatoes boiled to a porridge-like mush. Once in a while, they received salted herring straight from the salty brine with a couple of boiled potatoes. Dad remembered that the prison administration at Grini, you can go to the next now. Is that the next?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Isn't there? Oh, okay. Well, just
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, just leave it there. Sorry. Dad remembered that the prison administration at Grini in the fall of 42 ran out of toilet paper. So instead, they were all given small squares of cut up newspapers. This turned out to be the only way they received news from the outside, because these small paper pieces were read thoroughly before being used for their intended purpose. In this way, Dad learned, for instance, about the death of a friend of his from Grefsen Sports Club. Apart from this, they never received any kind of reading material, nor pencil or writing paper, nothing. Okay, this is about the fate of some of Norwegian Jews. Among the Jews who were sent to Grini was also Dad's friend, Herman Feldman. He and his family lived on the same street at Grefsen. Like Dad, Herman was also a member of Grefsen Sports Club. He never tried to hide that he and his family were Jews. Herman's parents, Rakel and Jakob Feldman, tried during the fall of 1942, when the Nazi persecution of the Jews escalated greatly, to escape to Sweden with the help of border pilots, but they never made it to Sweden. They were robbed and killed before they reached the border near Skrikerudtjern in Trøgstad. The pilots took money and a gold watch from the dead couple before they lowered them into a small lake. But a year later, the corpses floated to the surface, and then the whole story came out. It was well known that Jews were escaping with lots of money and valuables. After the war, there was a big court case in Norway related to the killing of the Feldman couple. A border pilot was a person who guided refugees across the border from Norway to Sweden. Almost 50,000 Norwegians used this way of fleeing. And although not everyone left for the most serious reasons, it was extremely important for Norwegian resistance activities that persons who were eagerly sought by the Germans could seek safety in our neighboring country. The percentage of refugees who died was low. The border pilots lived near the border and were indispensable to the heavy refugee traffic from Halden in the south to Finnmark in the north. It has been estimated that more than 1,000 pilots were at work for shorter or longer periods. Forest workers, truck drivers, taxi drivers, women, even children worked now and then as border pilots. During the Jewish pogrom in 1942, the pilots... Pardon? Oh, during the Jewish pogrom in 1942, the pilots on the most frequented routes had to guide refugees many times a week. It was hard work, lack of sleep, and a continued fear of being caught took its toll on the border pilots. When the border pilots were taken to court after the war, the case was about whether they had killed the Feldmans in order to enrich themselves or in order to keep secret their organization and their escape routes to Sweden. The court found them innocent of the murders, but in a second court case, they were sentenced for embezzlement of the money and a gold watch. One of the witnesses in the case supposedly stated that liquidations took place on orders from the highest ranks in London, where Norway's exile government stayed during the war. A book has been written about this case, and this book in turn has been made into a movie. Dad's friend Herman Feldman tried on his own to get to Sweden by train from Oslo to Halden. But during the train ride, German inspectors came on board. Herman jumped out of a train window. He fell and broke his shoulder and was captured. Dad remembers seeing his friend from his cell window as he arrived at Grini in a police car. He was sent directly from Grini to Auschwitz and was never heard from again. There were approximately 1,800 Jews in Norway in 1939. 900 of them were killed in Hitler's final solution. Okay, next, Bill. Norwegians thought of many different ways to protest the occupation. Today, they may seem like rather meek demonstrations, but of course it was important not to make the Germans angry. By fastening a paper clip to their lapel, for example, Norwegians took part in a common form of protest. We are sticking together. Or by writing H7, King Haakon the Seventh special sign, and his motto, everything for Norway, in unusual ways, and often written with chalk in the middle of the street. Some Norwegians had a comb visible in their breast pockets. We take care of ourselves. The word for to comb in Norwegian, å greie, also means to take care of. Red knitted caps became symbols of something really Norwegian. This symbol irritated the Germans so much that they prohibited Norwegians from wearing them. But when Christmas came, people wore blue or green knitted caps instead. And again, the occupation authority looked at this with great consternation. But in the end, there was not much they could do about it and pretty much gave up on this very stubborn Norwegian protest. Norwegians who cooperated with the occupation forces were labeled as informers. The Germans also placed fake informers at Grini as spies, but they were quickly recognized by the other prisoners. On the other hand, the designation Jøssing became an honorary nickname for a true Norwegian patriot. The name came from Jøssingfjord on the west coast, where British Navy forces on February 16, 1940, freed 300 English prisoners from a German ship. Striped was a description of a person with a dubious national attitude, one who could not be trusted, who was inclined to cooperate with the Germans and the Nazi authorities, to associate with them or to receive benefits from them. Dad said it was a very strange situation. Everything was so incredibly hush-hush. It was best to say and to know as little as possible about others. To tell on one person might mean death for many others. In 1956, after the war, I found a letter my mom wrote to one of her friends. Tomorrow I will appear as a witness in court, witnessing against the girl who was an informer. In all likelihood, she will be sentenced to death. She informed on a lot of young, nice men who were arrested and some even shot to death. She informed on me as well, but luckily for me, the peace arrived before they had a chance to arrest me. It will be very interesting to be present during one of these treason court cases. Next picture. At Mom's home at Lofthus, they kept chickens and rabbits during the war to supplement their limited food supply. Dad also remembers that they kept a villa pig. My grandparents were fortunate to have family in the countryside in Østfold County. They were able to get food from them when their ration cards were used up. From the very beginning of the occupation, the Germans began rationing of consumer goods. As the war years went on, food became more and more scarce. At first, rationing affected imported foods like coffee and sugar, then meat, eggs, and dairy products. And in 1942, also potatoes and vegetables were included. Both adults and children were issued ration cards. Babies, the sick, and pregnant women were given extra rations. Many people were able to get diagnosed with ulcers in order to add to their family's foodstuff with extra milk and white bread. Women spent lots of time waiting in long lines to buy food. The rationing did not end with the war in Norway. Butter, milk, and cream were rationed until 1949. Textiles could not be bought freely until 1954, and homes and cars were rationed all the way till 1960. The potato was the great savior in the Norwegian diet during the war. Without this humble root, which is so full of B and C vitamins and iron, there would have been starvation in Norway. All Norwegians ate incredible amounts of potatoes during the war years. Potatoes might be the main course or a side dish, boiled, fried, mashed, or added to other food products. It was kneaded into bread dough and added to cakes and waffles, soups, and even to margarine in order to make the food more filling. Mom signed up to be a Lotte during the war, a member of Norges Lotteforbund, Norwegian Women's Defense League. Thousands of Norwegian women wanted to become lotter when the war broke out in order to do their share in helping with social work, caring for the sick and injured, and for the prisoners of war. But in early 1943, the Germans put a stop to that kind of work, and the organization had to operate illegally and in secret. In the fall of 1940, the Nazis disbanded the sports clubs that were so popular among young Norwegians, like my mom and dad, and replaced them with the Department of Sport and Labor Service. But the Norwegian sportsmen and women protested this. They refused to take part in competitions held by the Nazis, and the public boycotted the Nazi sports meetings. Many athletes organized illegal sporting events. Next picture. In November 1943, Dad was taken to Møllergata 19, a prison in downtown Oslo by Youngstorget. He was there for 3 months. In his 89th year, Dad says he had a hell of a nightmare about something he experienced while at Møllergata 19. It was in the afternoon of December 19, 1943. A German ammunition ship, Selma, which was unloading goods at Filipstad Harbor, suddenly exploded. The explosion was so powerful that the windows shattered in Dad's cell several kilometers away. 1,600 explosives exploded all over town. Red-hot splinters rained down in the forests around Oslo. It was said that windows shook as far away as Karlstad in Sweden. An explosive fire quickly spread in Oslo. Next picture. 45 Norwegians were killed and 400 wounded. This was the biggest catastrophe in Oslo at the time. The big question was whether it was sabotage or not. German authorities completed their investigation fairly quickly, giving the Norwegians the impression that they either had suspicions about sabotage by their own people or that they simply thought it was an accident. Dad thought that the explosion meant that the Allied forces had begun an invasion. He was in solitary confinement and was given no information, but he was able to communicate with another prisoner via Morse code, which they knocked to each other through the wall. So in this way, in the course of 3 weeks, he found out about the explosion and about all the terrible destruction it caused in Oslo. Okay, the next picture. When on April 26, 43, Dad was ordered to appear at roll call back at Grini, he knew immediately that meant he was going to be taken to a concentration camp in Germany. He and his fellow prisoners first spent 2 days and nights in a cellar underneath Akershus Castle. This castle was used by the Germans both as a prison and a place of execution. After 2 days, they were ordered to line up with 2 meters distance, and then the order was shouted at them in German, "Los Mensch, los," and they were marched down to the harbor and onto a German ship, packed together below deck in a storage room. They were not allowed to come up to the deck until the ship was in open waters, probably outside of the mouth of Oslofjord. When the boat was sailing along the west coast of Sweden that night, Dad remembered how strange it was to see lights on land, lights coming from house windows. This was something that had not been seen in Norway since April 1940, because in every room where a lamp was lit, blinds must be pulled down and drapes closed, so the Allies would not see light and easy targets. A fine of from 20 to 50 kroner was issued for breaking darkening rules. If the rule was broken often, the electricity was cut off. Normal pull-down blinds could not be used for darkening. They didn't conceal enough. They had to use a much thicker black paper blind. Outdoor lights on private homes were prohibited. Trees and poles were given white painted stomach belts so people could orient themselves in the darkness. The German prison ship took Dad and his Norwegian fellow prisoners to Stettin in northern Germany on the Baltic Sea. Here, under the watchful eye of SS soldiers, they were ordered to enter a trick, streetcar, which Dad found almost comical. This trick took them from the harbor to the railway station. Then they went by train, a whole day's ride, to Oranienburg near Berlin and the concentration camp Sachsenhausen. Okay, next. The concentration camps were established by the Germans as ordinary prisons became too small to incarcerate all the political oppression in the Third Reich. Prisoners who never appeared in front of a court, who were never given a sentence, ended up here, imprisoned indefinitely. The first camp was Dachau near Munich already in 1933. The camps were run by Reichsführer Himmler and his SS Schutzstaffel. The prisoners in the tens of thousands of concentration camps were unwanted individuals. They were simply going to disappear, but because Germany needed workers, they were kept alive for a while, as long as they were able to work. When they were no longer of any use to the Nazis and their war machine, they were taken to the crematorium. You are either strong or dead, they said. Following the outbreak of the war, the camps were filled up by opposition fighters from all the occupied territories. In 1940, the Germans had 20 concentration camps and 165 work camps. The worst of them all were the extermination camps established in Poland with only one goal. There, the prisoners were sent to die immediately. First and foremost, Jews were sent there, but also gypsies and Russian political commissars. The total number of prisoners in all the camps have been estimated at 18 million during Hitler's Nazi regime. About 9,000 Norwegians were sent to these camps in the German-Polish era. Of the 2,500 Norwegian prisoners in Sachsenhausen, 200 died. Norwegian and Danish prisoners were given preferential treatment due to the fact that the Germans believed them to be more racially pure Aryans like themselves. Sachsenhausen was surrounded by tall, thick brick walls with rows upon rows of barbed wire fastened on top, guard towers with searchlights in every corner, and armed guards with orders to shoot at the slightest infraction. Dad entered into the long, long rows of miserable, skinny prisoners in worn prison garb, who were either barefoot or with ragged cloth pieces around their feet stuck into wooden shoes, all of them shuffling slowly along. The prisoner treatment was brutal, the food mostly insufficient, and the hygienic conditions deplorable. Next picture, please. Dad says that when they arrived in the concentration camp, they were received with blows and kicks and pushed around with rifle butts. One of the Norwegians who arrived with him had apparently looked at an SS guard with a sneering smile during the official entry into the camp. He was called up to the leader, who hit him hard, right smack in the face. His slave labor job in the camp was in the weapon factory, Waffen am Wald. His job consisted of loading and unloading, carrying and pulling on trolleys with large pipes. The weapon that was being produced was Panzerfaust, an anti-tank weapon. Dad said that they spent the whole day at work, had to get up at 4 a.m. every morning. Then everyone was counted and accounted for, and that procedure took a long time, as there were between 30 to 40,000 prisoners. He was unsure whether they got off on Sundays. It was difficult for him to remember this, he said, but he thought it was most likely that they worked and toiled each and every day. He said he did practically the same job day in and day out. One day, he was ordered up in a truck together with several SS men. They drove to Oranienburg to pick up something. He didn't remember what. His brother Kalle, on the other hand, was ordered to do an extremely dangerous kind of job in Sachsenhausen. He had to dig up bombs that had not been exploded. This was against any war regulations about what kind of work prisoners of war may do, Dad said. He and Kalle only met once during their many months in Sachsenhausen, even though they were there at the same time. Dad said, one day when we were getting ready to march outside from our barracks, after first having stood in long lines and washed ourselves, one of the most infamous prison guards came in. He was in charge of the execution commando. We heard him enter with his SS people. They had mounted the gallows and readied it outside on the square. The gallows was pulled out on a trolley every time it was going to be used and placed near the entrance to Sachsenhausen. The prison guards grabbed hold of my shoulder to look at my prison number, which was written on a piece of fabric we ourselves had had to sew onto the shirt of our blue and gray striped prison uniform. I thought for sure that my last hour had come, but then he suddenly pushed me brusquely away and back into the lineup again. Instead, the executioner grabbed a young Dutch boy who was standing next to me. We were all ordered out into the square. The SS men took the Dutch boy over to the gallows. I remember he was still carrying his work bag under his arm. The SS guard announced that the young boy was accused of sabotage. He was ordered to get up on a margarine crate. The Dutchman did not utter a single word, even when they put the looped rope around his neck and kicked away the margarine crate. He died instantly. 2 days later, the same procedure took place, but that time they took a Polish man and he screamed like a baby, Dad said. After the prisoners were murdered in this gruesome manner, they were simply thrown into a wooden wheelbarrow and taken away to the crematorium. Okay, next, please. During all the months while Dad was imprisoned in Sachsenhausen, he wore the same prison uniform. He also had to wear a kind of beret made of the same striped rough fabric. The prisoners were divided into categories and were given a small cloth triangle according to what kind of prisoners they were. A red triangle was for political prisoners, a green triangle for criminal prisoners, violet triangle, a Bible researcher or Jehovah's Witness, yellow triangle for the Jews, a black triangle for asocial person, or a pink triangle was for a homosexual. Dad had a red triangle. Dad said, across from my barracks, which was block number 24, there was a barracks housing Jews. This one was surrounded by bars and barbed wire. We heard rumors that they were printing false dollar bills, but we never found out anything for sure, he said. He said he mostly ate decent food in Sachsenhausen. He cannot remember exactly what the food consisted of, but he thinks he got oats, butter, salami, and cheese, among other things. At the time he was there, all the Norwegian and Danish prisoners received Red Cross food packages from Switzerland and other neutral countries. In addition to foods, the packages also contained American cigarettes. Dad does not remember anyone who did not smoke. Cigarettes were very popular. They were also used as barter for food. They slept in 5-story bunk beds, often 2 and 3 in the same bed, but they were frequently moved around as new prisoners arrived and others disappeared. The mattresses were made of rough sackcloth filled with straw, and Dad said they smelled of piss and vomit. He related how he sometimes went for little walks around his barracks with Per Hareide, whom he knew from Grefsen Sports Club. They were confidants then, he said. They could speak openly to each other, but after the war, they never had any contact. Next picture. The prisoners were allowed to receive and write only 1 letter per month. All the letters, both coming in and going out of Sachsenhausen, were censored by the Nazi camp authorities. They were painted over with a dark blue line when the letter had been accepted by the censors, and everything had to be written in German. This is a picture of an envelope written by my mom sent to my dad in Sachsenhausen. Dad became very sick during his time in Sachsenhausen, twice. Once he contracted diphtheria and spent 3 weeks in the sick bay called Revier. While he was there, he got scarlet fever. There was no enclosure or wall between those who had contagious diseases and those who did not. All kinds of infectious diseases ravaged the camp. A constant lack of medicines made everything worse. Even though the first sulfa medicines had entered the market in the early 40s, these medicines were naturally not available to the patients in Germany's concentration camps. Dad said that both German and Norwegian doctors were there. He remembered being treated by a Norwegian doctor who was an okay man. He never saw Americans in the camp. However, he did see Englishmen. A group of glider pilots who had been shot down over Stavanger were taken prisoners and sent to Sachsenhausen. There they were given a gruesome torture, he said. Every day, all day, they had to march around the parade grounds over asphalt, loose sand, pebbles, and sharp rocks. They were to soften up new military boots for German soldiers. In addition, they had to sing the whole time, Dad remembered. Many Russian prisoners came to Sachsenhausen. They were treated terribly by the Germans, and they were quickly executed. The crematorium smokestack spewed smoke the whole time Dad was in the camp. A Russian fellow followed him around for a long time, he said, because Dad once gave him a small cigarette butt. He also remembered a terrible bully among his fellow prisoners, a German who was there because he had murdered someone. He tried to make friends with the Norwegians in order to get cigarettes from them. In the spring of 1944, there were close to 2,000 Norwegians in Sachsenhausen. Because they were able to receive packages, they also achieved a somewhat improved status and position in the camp. In the summer of 1944, the mood in Germany had clearly changed. The Germans were afraid and uncertain. Hitler had promised them victory, German victory on all fronts, and by now the Allied forces had come across the Channel, while at the same time the German Reich was being bombed everywhere, and the country was in a state of disintegration. There were rumors that Himmler had a plan to exterminate all the concentration camp prisoners when the Allied fronts came close and Germany might have to surrender. Okay, the next picture, please. And the next, I can go back and forth a little bit between these two. Just before the end of the war, before Germany descended into total chaos, Dad was saved when the Red Cross buses, the white buses came from Sweden to gather up Norwegian and Danish prisoners and take them home to Norway and Denmark. Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish duke and vice president of the Swedish Red Cross, began in the fall of 1944 to consider transferring Norwegian civil prisoners from Germany to Sweden. The idea was first launched by a Norwegian diplomat, Nils Christian Ditleff, who was head of prison operations in Stockholm. After having negotiated with Himmler in Berlin, Bernadotte arranged for a grand evacuation in March and April of 1945 and of Norwegian and Danish civil prisoners, first to Denmark and then on to Sweden. In this way, 27,000 prisoners were rescued from Germany before that country disintegrated. Okay, you can go back to the buses. Yeah, thank you. One condition for succeeding at this huge undertaking was the availability of lists of names of Norwegians and Danes who were in the various camps. This name mapping was done by a group of Norwegians, by the Norwegian seamen's ministers in Hamburg, by the Danish consul general in Hamburg, and others. Dad wanted me to write something about his mother's contact with Vanda Hjort, the daughter of a Norwegian Supreme Court lawyer, Johan B. Hjort. Early in the 1930s, Johan B. Hjort became second in command for Vidkun Quisling in National Samling, the Nazi party in Norway. But because Hjort, after a few years, withdrew from the organization, all of the Hjort family, himself, his wife, and 4 children, were forcefully moved to Germany when the occupation of Norway began. They were installed by the Germans at an old castle called Grosskreutz, not far from Berlin and Sachsenhausen. Vanda Hjort, the daughter, has written a book about this, Every Friday in Front of the Gate. The Hjort family were not prisoners. They were able to do limited travel within Germany, but they were not allowed to leave the country. Vanda Hjort and her family worked tirelessly to collect and keep files of all the Norwegian and Danish prisoners in all the German concentration camps. Dad's mom wrote her a letter to try and get information about both Kalle and Dad. Vanda wrote back and told her that Kalle was alive and Dad had recovered from a long illness. This, of course, was great news for the whole family. The so-called white buses included hundreds of buses, ambulances, trucks, and cars. The vehicles were equipped with Red Cross signs and Swedish flags in order to protect them from airstrikes. The Allied forces were warned that this rescue operation was going to take place, but no one could guarantee their safety. Folke Bernadotte wanted to take the prisoner transport to outside of Germany's borders, but Himmler would only accept that they were transported to a collection camp in Neuengamme outside of Hamburg. When the buses arrived at Sachsenhausen, the prisoners were called up by their names in the early morning, as usual, in alphabetical order. The Germans were still very much in charge, although Folke Bernadotte's people were allowed input as to who could leave the camp. Dad said he was lucky that his last name began with a B, so that he was among the first to be called. First, they were gathered in the washing barracks. Then they were told that the buses had arrived, although the SS people still controlled everything. And then the air raid warning sounded. The Allied forces were bombing nearby Oranienburg, so close to Sachsenhausen. Many of the prisoners panicked at that moment. Their rescue was so near, and the thought of being killed by Allied bombs then was too much for some. Dad remembered a man from Bergen who screamed like a baby and threw himself under one of the dining tables, and he had been a bragging, boisterous guy among the prisoners. On the way north through bombed-out Germany, the convoy of buses stopped for several days in the concentration camp Neuengamme. Here, the Norwegian prisoners were ordered by the Germans to clear out and clean up a barracks, which actually was a large brick building. It was such a gruesome cleanup, he said. They found stacks upon stacks of corpses. Some were still barely alive. They had to carry these corpses and dying people down and out to a square in front of the building. And there they had to put them in big piles while the Germans kept guard with their weapons ready to shoot. On the road past Hamburg, Dad saw happy and waving school children who had the day off because it was Hitler's birthday, April 20. He also saw lots of bombed out buildings and villages along the whole way. Next picture, please. Yeah. After the buses left Neuengamme, they spent one night in Friedrichsruh in the forest near the Danish border. And here the convoy was attacked by pathfinders from RAF, low-flying British bombers. It turned out okay, they were not hit. Then finally, the prisoners were told that they were on their way to Denmark, that they were going home to Norway. Dad was lucky and got a window seat in the bus from there. He kept the window open the whole way. When the convoy of white buses finally left Germany and they were on the road north through Jylland in Denmark, he noticed that also here the kids were out of school, but for a very different reason than in Germany. They were celebrating the end of the war. Through the open bus window, he got a hold of a flower bouquet from little Helga Torning from Kolding, a cute 7-year-old schoolgirl who also had included a little note to go with the flowers. Dad answered this note with a thank you letter when he got back home to Oslo. And this meeting, or rather this flower greeting between Dad and Helga, was the start of a lifelong friendship between our two families. Next, please. When the buses finally made it across Öresund to Sweden, the prisoners were installed at Öranäs, a closed-down castle military camp in southern Sweden. Here they were guarded by Swedish soldiers who had the bayonets drawn on the tip of their rifles, pointing at the Norwegian prisoners. The very strict precautions the Swedes took were due to the prisoners having to be deloused, and they were terrified of contagious diseases. They were prohibited from leaving the place on their own, but Dad said the temptation was too great for him and a friend. They stole 2 bikes and got onto a train that was going to Stockholm. Dad wanted to try and find his brother Fricken, who was there. But the 2 runaways were caught and brought back to the camp, where they patiently had to wait until Swedes were ready to send them to Norway by train as free men. Next, please. When the train with the former Sachsenhausen prisoners arrived at Östbanen, the central railway station in Oslo, there was a lot of excitement, throngs of happy people with Norwegian flags. Lots of friends and relatives were there to greet them, of course. Among them was Marit, my mom, with a large bouquet of flowers. A photographer from the Daily Dagbladet took pictures of them as they saw each other for the first time in 3 years. These photos appeared on the front of the paper the next day. After the war began in 1968, Dad began to receive a war pension from the Norwegian government. This included free doctor and dentist treatments, so Dad said this meant a lot to him. He also received compensation from the German government for the slave work he was forced to perform in the concentration camp. Thank you very much. That was it.
Well, thank you, Nina. That was very good. Appreciate it. Bill, are you
Very much.
available?
And
Yeah.
we're going to have Janet. We'll talk a little bit, give us some historical background, and then we'll go to questions. Is that good?
Yes.
Janet, are you?
I'm right here. So
Good. Yeah.
share screen.
Yes.
And then let's see, I have to do something quick here. Okay, I promised Bill I wouldn't talk long because there's lots of questions for Nina. But just to give you an idea of how things worked with the resistance. So we all know about the invasion. All the major ports were attacked. And we know that at the end of the war, June 10th, in 1940 is when the country was totally occupied. So now what? What's going to happen next? So some of the earliest forms of resisting was the boats. But when I was doing early research on the Using affair, I began to read a lot of, they were translated into English, a lot of literature. And one book that really struck me is the allegory, The House in the Dark. And forgive me if I don't pronounce it right, Terje Vejas. He was a very well-known novelist. He wrote this book in January of 1945. He showed the manuscript, because it still occupied Norway, and he showed the manuscript to his pastor, and he said, don't show it, don't publish it, bury it. So it was actually buried in the ground. And then in the fall of 1945, it was published. But this is a really interesting way of this. It's an allegory, and he's talking about what happened when the occupation began and how the beginning of resistance began. It's this darkness that came upon the house while the house was asleep, settled over and will not go away. It sprang up like a seething spring, so the windows were blinded and more became dumb. And from out of the darkness came people who held all the power. They lit up corridors with their bright shining arrows and then went about making their own house within the house. And at once the silent storm began wearing it down. So the house in the dark is Norway. So what's really interesting, I interviewed so many men in the very beginning of my journey on history of Norway in World War II. And one of the ones was the Kismariva Club. So on April 9th, I'm gonna have to move my thing up here because I can't see some of my, get that out of the way. On April 9th, 1940, more than 1,000 Norwegian ships and 27 seamen were at sea. In fact, the Germans were really, they made a huge mistake. They thought they could capture all these ships. They also didn't realize that all the nets for fishing were made in America or Great Britain. So Quisling immediately got on when he got on the radio, he said, requested all captains of merchant ships to proceed to Norwegian, German, or neutral ports to wait for further instructions. But not one complied, and instead they sent telegrams that read, to victim Quisling, Norway, Miskariva, kiss my ass, excuse my language. On April 10th, King Haakon went on the radio and said to ignore Quisling's orders and go to neutral ports. And what's significant about this is they have so many boats were out, and later the whaling ships were added in just a few weeks. They would become to form Nortr's ship. The other thing that was happening almost the first day, people were fleeing to Sweden, but many people on the West Coast fled to England, Scotland, the Shetland Islands, in whatever vessel they had. And there are stories of people that rowed their way to England or to Scotland. Many of these fishing boats would become part of Shetland Bus, SOE Norway, which is another wonderful story. So how did this all happen? Well, resisting began organically. I mean, you could wear the clothing and the paper clips and all that. That happened a while later, but it was very organic. Friends, families, or colleagues at work. Some were members of with some military service or had fought in the very early days of the invasion. One example was Gabriel Smith, who ran the Oslo office of bell ships. And he was a reserve officer in the Navy, started a resistance group with other prominent Norwegians. It would include radio operators and different cells gathering intelligence. So a year after the German invasion, things were very organic and it's not connected, which is dangerous because they didn't really understand what they were up against. But the resistance became more formalized. So the most important group was Milorg. And it was formed in May 1941, almost a little more than a year after the occupation began. It was organized, all these resistant groups that wanted to participate in internal military resistance. And in November 1941, Milorg became aligned with the Norwegian High Command in London, British Army Department, and they dealt with sabotage operations. Now, SOE, which was Churchill's brainchild, the counterpart to Milorg, they operated independently. And this led to the tragedy of Televåg and other tragic incidents. By the end of 42, the two groups did begin to coordinate. And partly is that the fear of reprisals. This is from showing at the map what it looked like. Initially, there were 5 divisions. You see Oslo, the number 5 is Trondheim and Trøndelag and so on. By the end of the war, the groups were much narrowed down and they're operating independently but together. And near the, starting after the fall of Paris in August of 1944, many Norwegians who were in Sweden, they were being trained to get ready. And there's also training going on in the mountains. Seaborg was part of the civilian part, and it took care of the political, religious, labor, and other internal problems. They also handled the printing and distribution of the legal newspapers. And again, these started up very spontaneously as well. There was an effort to kind of coordinate, but that turned into quite a disaster also later on. One of my favorite people is Conrad Bonnie Svensson. He was the minister for the deaf in Norway. And he was a member of Seaborg concerning church matters. And church played a very important part. They pushed up against any attempts to Nazify the churches. And he also hid food for the resistant groups behind the altar in his church for the deaf in Norway. He held secret meetings both at his church and at the deaf school, which is a large complex area that's southeast of Oslo. He had secret meetings. He might go to Bergen and he would meet with people at the deaf school there. Most importantly, no one knew this, but there was a very tight group called the Coordinating Committee, I think 5 members, and later it got down to what they called the Circle. And he was part of that. He had a very high, important role. XU stands for unknown and U for undercover. And their purpose was to collect maps and photos of German fortifications and forces. And the wonderful book Occupied is talking about the author's dad. He didn't know that his dad was an XU, and it's a pretty dangerous group to be in with because you didn't live very long. It was first organized by leadership with a military background. It added students from the University of Oslo, and eventually XU included professionals around Norway within railroads, police, and others. And one famous one was Anne Sophie Osbeth, who was a chemistry student at the university, and she would become the deputy commander of XU. This position fell to her after the leader was caught. The other group was Export, and you talked about the people that helped them get over. It helped people hunted by the Gestapo to get out of the country. And a number of Jews did make it through the Shetland bus, that's part of it, or into Sweden. And then, an agent or somebody who was in trouble, you went that way. So this leads us to the Horten gang. So I'm just curious. I'm a curious person. So I contacted a friend of mine, Bob Pearson, in UK. We've been together online for over 25 years, and he's very knowledgeable about so many things. I said, did you ever hear of the Horten gang? And he said, well, I kind of heard about it. So, because this is the thing that affected the family, Nina's family. And so I ended up getting both a picture from Bob of the group and also a link to an article about one of the people in it. I went and asked permission to show the picture, And I heard back from a gentleman who sent me something called Milorg Horten. So between those two things that I translated very painfully from Google Translate, because I'm a beginner reader, to get an idea, what was this group? So Carl von Zern in Horten was the main base for the Royal Norwegian Navy. And it had important shipbuilding operation, which the Germans took over. The ships were pressed into service. Small groups in Horten and surrounding counties started resistant groups. A local sports team in Horten was one of them. And this is, again, this organic building of resisting is happening pretty early on. And it's uncoordinated, and they don't know what they're doing, which causes lots of problems. In the fall of 1941, 10 men, led by Olav Vesterås, formed a secret group to sabotage and damage the German military. And so they're concentrated in this area around Horten, but it goes quite a wide range of places. They eventually had made a connection to a main Oslo group. Vesterås operated a car transport for the Germans. So he was driving cars for the Germans, but he regularly stole arms, ammunition, and communication equipment, which, by the way, was very important for the resistance. This is stuff that radio operators could use. And it was hidden by 100% loyal employees. The members of the local sports club joined the Horten group, and one of them was this man named Gunnar Kardal, and his father was the leader of the building inspectors at the shipyard. He grew up there, and he was a very young man. I think he was 20, and he was a well-known pole vaulter. So he's one of the people that joined the group. And it turns out from the information I translated last night is that Horten actually had several different groups that were part of the Horten group, because eventually they'll be connected to something more formal in Oslo, which was important. So the group often met in cabins in Falkenstein where they received training. The group grew. In the early spring, a man, so this is in the spring of 1942, they only know him as Stor Tor, sometimes TG, which I think stands for the same thing. He arrived from England to train the different Milorg cells in the Horten gang. And what's real interesting as I translated this is that they were very suspicious of him. And again, it shows this kind of uncoordination that's going on in early 42. And they were suspicious of him at first because he was looking for a group, but he was finally confirmed by Oslo that yes, he is come here to train you, to train your group for Milorg. One of the things that's happening there, though, Quisling, a former member of Johansvern, he's not identified in the documents, worked for the Gestapo in Horten. So this is the beginning of the problems. According to Kardal, the Gestapo received news that an agent from England was working in the Horten district. So this is around, he arrived probably in spring, so I would imagine it was March. And you have to remember what is going on in the broader context in 42. The teachers are on strike in Ulesund in the end of February. So the teachers go on strike February 5th. The end of February 1942, some kids tried to escape from a boat to Scotland. And it was actually, I believe, Rinnan's first operation. He uncovered the group, the boys were arrested. And so this stuff is starting to, the Germans are really starting to push hard. So we hear this news that an agent is in the district from the spy that is working his way around in Horten. Then you have the razzia on Televåg. And of course, in May, just days after this, and this is based on the two different reports that I got from, I ended up hearing from the Marine Museum. They're the ones that sent me this report called Milorg Horten. And they made a connection between Televåg and Stor Tor's fiance. So all this stuff is happening. You've got your families is hiding people. They're miles away from Horten. But these connections are starting to happen because remember, 2 agents were arrested, 1 was shot, and the 2 Gestapo people were killed on the 26th of April. And they started making these, they're interrogating people. The Tella family are being interrogated in Bergen, and all of a sudden these connections are starting to move east across the country. So he was arrested while visiting his parents in Drammen. He was wounded in a shootout. And I find this really interesting because your aunt was arrested in Drammen. And I wondered if there was some family that she knew there while she was going to nursing school. You know,
Not that I know
we'll never know.
of.
So members in the Horten gang were quiet. They assumed the agent was dead and things were safe, but he was alive, being tortured. Several members of the Milorg of Horten Air left for Sweden, but most of them stayed, and they stayed calm. It looked like we're okay. Then July 9th, the Gestapo struck again. Arrested a number of tourist contacts. So look at the places: Oslo, Drammen, Kongsberg, Notodden, and Horten. But those 2, Oslo, Drammen, he must have had contact with your family's house as a place.
Mhm.
You know, so this is how all this thing just sort of fell apart. And here's the map to give an idea. You know, so I actually visited Drammen when I was in Norway. One of my high school chums lives there. And so I got a chance to take the train from Oslo and go out and visit with them. But this gives you an idea. Here's Horten down here. All along this area, they were different groups that were part of the Horten group. But once that information got out, they just grabbed everybody. This is roughly where your street is.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So just to give an idea, but again, so all this stuff is going on. So when Televogue happened, they took the boys they took 18 of the Ellison boys and shot them in retaliation. And as a result of Televogue, this is why SOE Norway stopped doing their independent work, because they actually they were not in connection with Milorg. Milorg was trying to stay down, keep their heads down, do a little bit of stuff, but don't cause any reprisal. And Televogue is a horrible reprisal. They raised everything. All the men went to Sachsenhausen. The women were put in a high school north of Bergen. And the same thing happened, the fate of all the men that went to the Horten group. 29 of them were sent to Grini, including Kardal, but he ended up in Dachau. And he didn't realize almost the whole time he was there that he was considered Nachkanevel, meaning NN. That means he had a secret trial which he knew nothing about, and nobody in the courts knew nothing about in Norway. And he was essentially condemned to death. And the way you put him to death, as you said earlier, was to work people to death. So he was at that, both Dachau, but they also sent him up to that other place you talked about, the place that was the staging area. That was actually a death camp too. But then he sent him back to Dachau, and he was also saved by the white buses as well. He was able to get out of there. So this is the lucky find by just yakking with people on email. But this is the Horten gang. They all got together. This is days after liberation. So they're probably back there in time maybe for, Svente Mai. 4 of them died in the concentration camp, including the gentleman, Westerås. He died, but another leader survived. And what's really interesting, this is him up here, Kardal. He regained his health and went back into track after the war. And Jim Mathias, I don't know if you remember, I vaguely remember him as a little girl, but he was one of the US's top track and field. And he beat him in pole vaulting. And I was thinking, like, that's pretty amazing to get his health back. So that's the Horton story and the bigger picture, but you can see that it was a horrible year. They call it roll-ups back then. It started in the South, so really, maybe it started with the Horton gang being exposed, and it just went all the way up to Tromsø. All these places were exposed. It was a terrible year for the resistance, and they're going to have to regroup the next year. So I hope that gave a little context.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it does give very good context. So now, Janet can
I have to unshare.
unshare, and we'll have questions for both Nina and Janet.
I'm trying to do that, and it's not happening, so
Okay. It's a little tricky.
I'm not getting it to come up.
Nina, can you kind of relate what it was like at the end of the war when your father came home? And,
I wasn't born.
Well-
I'm not that old.
well, at the time, so what is your recollection of those times? Because you know,
I
it
don't.
was well up in the 60s before.
I don't have. You know, I was born after the war, and so all of this is my conversations with my dad. So
Okay.
I don't have any. No, I mean he. As far as I said in the beginning too, he never wanted to talk about what he went through there. It was impossible to get him to talk about it. He always said, I'm not a hero. I don't want to talk about what I went through. So it was just towards the very end of his life that Keith and I sat down and talked to him when we were at the nursing home visiting him in 2004, and he finally opened up. My brother and I had tried for years. My brother had given him a little tape recorder that he could talk to, and but it never worked. So we were fortunate that it worked in the end.
No, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, that is very common that people will say, you know, that they're not a hero and they don't want to talk about it,
Yeah.
despite the fact that they clearly were doing things that were very heroic.
Could I, this is Keith. I wonder if I could say something to Janet, because this is it's very good. We go to Norway. I've always been looking for a book on World War II in English, a comprehensive book, and I've never found one. I've looked everywhere. And what you've given us is something that I've never heard before. Much more flesh. And I mean, there's a lot about the seamen that were very courageous, and nothing has been written in English as far as I know. Do you know of any good book that on the Second World War in Norway that or by Norwegians that's available? Janet?
I'm not sure if I'm the best one. I have a new reader who's been sending me books. His parents were married in the Deaf Church in Oslo. And I don't know, my book, that it's been out for years, and it's written by both an American and a Norwegian, it's Blood in the Midnight Sun. That really got me going. But I don't know, there's a lot of books that were published in the 70s and, you know, they're going out of my head, but they were written by people who were in the resistance, given overall. There is one, maybe I can find it and can share it, you know, maybe through the Facebook page. There is one that I read about, but it's been out a number of years. So there's new stuff coming out all the time. But it was written, I think, in the 80s, and it's a comprehensive overview from beginning to end. But I don't remember the title on the top of my head. I could probably lean over and grab my bibliography, but
If you could send the name of that to Dina, I'd appreciate it.
yeah, you know.
And of your book, I haven't heard that either.
Yeah, mine is Jussing, And, it's really fun. The Daughters of Norway is one of the chapters. I belong here too. And when we could, we have one of the best Christmas fairs ever. We have a lot of people attend. And I was standing there with the book, and this woman came by. She went by me and she did a complete bounce face because she saw the word Jussing. And she said, I was born in Fjord. And she knew exactly. She's wonderful. She lives, I think, just north of me. But she said she was shocked, but she knew how that word came about by the commandos rescuing all those people. But yeah, I don't know. There may be more recent stuff. It's more comprehensive. Mine is just stuff that I've just gathered over the years. And people are so gracious to share their story. I feel like it's both an honor and a sacred privilege to listen. And by writing fiction, sometimes it's fascinating. These historical fiction groups I'm in, they're all watching Atlantic Crossing. They have never, ever heard about Norway in World War II. So they're all yakking with me, and you go here, go there. But it's really interesting because it's not being talked about.
The just quick thing, the Norwegian History Group, our Norwegian History Roundtable, did 2 programs on the Norway Merchant Marine in World War II, and both of them are available on our YouTube channel. And you just go to the website, or if you have trouble, give me a call, programs@norwaydc.org, and I'll point you to them. But we have 2 very nice YouTube presentations, and people talking not about their experience, about their father's experiences during the war, and putting in a good context of what happened. And but a lot of the Norwegian Merchant Marine was a very important part of the Allied victory, and Churchill very much recognized that.
Can I chime in there a minute? I have to
Yes.
say my father was one of those seamen who sailed for Norway as a Norwegian merchant marine during the war. And I'm going to get emotional. It's the whole reason I'm here.
I know.
That's wonderful to hear. We have other members. I don't know if they're on tonight, but that spoke at that presentation. 2 members whose fathers were also in there, and then a historian who, like Janet, put things in context.
Right.
And it is, when you hear the human story and then a historian talking about it, it's just a great combination.
Yeah. He met my mother in the US, and she was from Norway. Her mother was, her family's Norwegian, and the reason she didn't go back was because of the occupation. So she met
I'd
him
like to
here.
mention a book that I just sort of almost finished, called Last Hope Island. And it doesn't focus on Norway, but it's on all the other, Norway and several other governments who were occupied during, by the Germans, ended up in England. And England is the Last Hope Island. And it sort of talks about their influence on getting England involved in the war, and then eventually getting the US involved in the war. And the opening couple of chapters is all on a blow-by-blow description. It's like you're watching The King's Choice. He really focuses on Håkon and the invasion in Oslo, and it's a really good book. Probably only less than a quarter of it is on Norway. It really focuses on de Gaulle and, some of the other, the Poles. The Poles were very underappreciated. Anyway, it's a good book, Last Hope Island.
A lot of people don't realize the Poles and French were fighting with the Allies. That's one of the first shocking things I ever learned. And they were kind of in the middle near Molde. They were trying to stop the group. And the books that I use for the spy books, they're written by the British Naval Intelligence, which my college has. And the problem was that they had maps in a Baedeker from about 1920s. You can find that Baedeker online, and that's the maps that they had.
Yeah.
And so the first project with this geographic division of naval intelligence was to do Norway. The books are amazing. I have shared the maps before, and I just got it again because I'm working on a new prequel. But they're so detailed. You could say, oh, they've got coffee buffet, you know, at this train station, but they were meant for the spies. But mapping was very difficult. Also, the Germans for the first time were parachuting. They practiced in Poland, but some areas around Molde, they were up there, and people that were up there, you know, up there didn't know what was happening. These guys are showing up with parachutes. But for the Allies, they got stuck in swamps, and the terrain was, there was no reliable map. That's one of the reasons why it was failing.
Just a quick thing, a good one volume history of World War II is Inferno by Max Hastings. He's a British writer, but it's a pretty balanced account. If you just want a one volume account that goes through all the theaters and everything of what happened in rather remarkable detail, that's a good place to start.
Well, I'll find that book. It's in my bibliography. It's been out for a while, but it was very comprehensive. And, you know, I was Xeroxing like crazy back in the day. So I have all these files of sections on what I needed to know. But I think it's pretty good. But there must be more recent ones that would be helpful. But there's so many parts to it, you know.
You know, we have a lot that we sell at our Christmas festival, but they're not overall views. But there are books on the Shetland bus and books on, you know, the prisoners and all that. But yeah, one overall view would be good to have.
Yeah, there's so many moving parts during the war. I mean, it's so many theaters of operation. It's hard to keep everything straight. Nina, I really have to thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
And what is the, you know, going through it, what thing did you find the most interesting in your research? What factors was probably the most shocking or surprising or most unusual?
Well, his stay at the different concentration camps, and I went back to Sachsenhausen. I visited there for the first time 3 years ago with one of my sons and my grandson, and that was very, very interesting for me to have my grandson go there, and my son too. But he was 15 at the time, and it made a big impression on him. I had written this story some years ago, and I had given it to my grandson he had it on just on his telephone, you know, but he had read it, and we went through the concentration camp with him looking at what I had written there. That was very, very interesting. We saw the bunk beds where they lived in, and there was a little museum where you could see kind of the food that they had received, and yeah, it was very interesting. It was shocking, of course, horrible things what they went through.
Yes, it really was.
Yeah, amazing that they made it.
Yeah, the Televogue men were sent to Sachsenhausen, and some were outright murdered there. But a few made it back. Actually, I was trying to think, because I can't pronounce it right, but the military museums, it's Forsvet, I think it's called, history film. They actually run really wonderful programs on YouTube. And there are those 2 sections on Milorg. It's in Norwegian, and it's good for me to listen and kind of figure out what's going on. You know, I'm beyond hard to bra, you know. But
Can I ask Janet,
they're
what
very
is this?
well done.
What, Janet, what is it you're talking about right now? What is this?
It's on YouTube. It's let me find it. It's Force Vet. What is that? That means military, I think. History film.
Uh-huh.
I'll go try to find one and I'll put it in the chat. But they're very good. They've got stuff on Milorg. I think there was one on Televogue that was really an eye opener because they interviewed some of the survivors of that, many of them who were children. But it does seem from this article that I read that Televogue was the catalyst for everything falling apart that led to all kinds of tragedy because so much was exposed. But anyway, I'll try to go find it and I'll put it in the chat.
That'd be great.
They're really good.
Also, there's a lot of very good resources on the internet. The Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica have very good articles, and they're very comprehensive about all the battles and ships and everything. There's a series, I think it's Ghost History, sort of an odd term, but they're doing a series on World War II where they have a 10-minute talk about each week of World War II. So you can see what happened from a chronological viewpoint. And I think they're up to 1942. So that's an ongoing series. Plus they have like special things on Pearl Harbor or individuals. And that's quite good. There's just a lot of stuff out there and a lot of it is quite interesting.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat. So this is the YouTube. It's done by the major museums for Varzette.
Lisa, I wanted to say to you that there's a series of 6 very thick books. They are novels, but they are written by a Norwegian Jon Michelet, and I don't think they have been translated, but they are all about the convoys across the Atlantic that your dad was part of. It's fascinating.
And what is the name of that again?
His name is Jon Michelet. He's a very famous author in Norway, and I don't think it's 6 big thick books that he wrote about the convoys, and it would be very interesting for you.
Yes.
You speak enough Norwegian, you could read them.
Lite grann.
Yeah, I remember.
So, well, it's well, again, I'd really like to just want to make sure any further questions.
Nina, can you email me the name?
Oh, yes, I have your email address.
Yes,
Still, I'm sure.
thank you.
I will, Lisa.
Thank you.
So,
Nina,
anyway,
do you, just with something quick, just something personal about your father and the telling of the story, Nina. I'm guessing this was a really good thing for him. You know, it might have been very hard at first.
You know, I don't know. I think so. It probably was, but by then he was almost 90. But he, I was able to get it published, the story that I made before he died. We had it published in a local historical society in Oslo, and also in a magazine called Krigsinvaliden. And I asked his permission to do that, and he said yes, and he was pleased that happened. So I think, yeah, I think it was a release for him in a way, Marie. I think so. Yeah, I'm glad I got it done.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
And it also has been good for my my family, my kids over here, and like I said, my grandkids too.